I just finished Far Sector by N.K. Jemisin and Jamal Campbell, and it is fantastic. However, I do feel like the thoughts I'm giving you today aren't quite as fresh as they might have been because I took longer to read through this graphic novel than I intended to, and therefore, by the time I finished it, I feel like my thoughts of how much I enjoyed it, the first half of it, kind of got away from me, if you know what I mean. So bear that in mind as we talk about this. But for those of you who don't know, Far Sector is a DC Limited series which focuses on the Green Lantern Sojourner Mulane, who I believe might be new to this story, might be a new Green Lantern character, and it takes place entirely on this world which is far, far, far away from anything we know. So you can read this without knowing anything about Green Lantern. You can read this without knowing anything about DC Comics and the DC Universe. You can just enjoy this by itself and have a great time with it. Literally, anything you need to know about the way Green Lantern's power works is explained to you within the narrative, and it's not that complicated. It's a ring that works on willpower. Sometimes it runs out. It can create hard light constructs. I don't know if they're called hard light, but that's basically what they are. Sojourner Mulane has been sent to this civilization which requested a Green Lantern in the wake of some unrest which is stirring because this society of 3 different species, one of which is kind of like people-like, but they kind of have wings and stuff. One of which is very plant-like and carnivorous, and one of which is a race of digital beings, artificial intelligences. They all get together and work together so well because they are a society where everyone is forced to have this thing called the emotion exploit, which means that they do not feel emotions. However, near the start of this story, it's basically premise, so it's not a spoiler, the first murder in hundreds of years happens, and it rocks the foundations of society, and you gotta figure out why it happened, and all this stuff. Now, this book is almost a 5 out of 5 for me, but there are a few nitpicks I have about it, and one of them is I'm not sure I agree with the way that emotion is relayed here, because when I tell you that this is a city where people have forsaken their emotions, they cannot feel, you would expect them to be presented in a very kind of robotic or understated kind of a way, right? But these people still argue, they still yell and scream at each other. There is a scene very early on in the council chambers where the councillors are screaming at each other over a disagreement, and Joe says, and this is what they're like with the emotion exploit, and I'm like, yeah, that they clearly have emotions. So I kind of had to headcanon that actually it's not that it gets rid of their emotions, but it just suppresses them. And I think the story works a lot better that way. But it's interesting because Jo Mulane does not have the emotion exploit. She is still allowed to have her emotions, and this is brought up to her frequently throughout the story, like, oh, well, you're clearly only reacting this way because you have emotions, and therefore you are vulnerable to madness, and clearly you just had a fit of madness about this situation. But as we learn, and I guess we'll start getting into some more spoilery territory here, because I do want to talk about the story entire, but as we learn, there is a drug going around called Switch Off, which allows people to bypass the emotion exploit, which is part of why this murder took place. And the kind of civil unrest comes from people wanting to legalize Switch Off so that they can actually feel their emotions. There are, of course, a lot of parallels to our real world in this story. As with all the best science fiction, we are making our problems fantastical so as to look at them from another perspective. If we outlaw the colour blue in the real world and then everyone yells at each other about it and says it's fine that we're outlawing the colour blue, and then you write a science fiction novel about a race of people who outlaw the ability to smell, and you'd be like, that's crazy, I wouldn't outlaw the ability to smell. You could go, aha! But is it any different to outlawing the colour blue? There you go, there's my summation of why science fiction exists. I really like our main character, Sojourner Mulane. She's fantastic. She's so sassy, and she's bi as well, which I like, or at least that's kind of how I perceive her. I don't know if it's explicitly stated in this story. But yeah, what I really love about this story is that there's also a lot of discussion about abuse of power, both from the very top in terms of the government and also from the perspective of a police force. And here's where I'm going to say something that DC Comics fans might not like. I've also recently been reading the Jeff Johns Green Lantern run, and there are moments, and this isn't like I'm not horrified by it. I don't have strong emotions towards this. But there are moments in that story where, for instance, Hal Jordan starts beating on a villain who is in a cell because the villain smack-talked him. And that's just okay for him to do because the villain is the villain. And it's good versus evil. But that always sat wrong with me, and I eventually stopped reading that run of Green Lantern because those kinds of things just kept happening, and it tainted my view of the character. And this book feels like it's almost written as a response to that kind of writing. In fact, we learn throughout the story that when she gets her ring, she's not told to be without fear, she's told to be with fear, because that's where willpower truly shines, is when you can accept that you have fears and you have to live with them and you have to go through with things despite them. That is the true essence of having willpower. And I really like that, and I really like everything this book has to say about issues within our society. It just felt like the voice of the author felt right, if you know what I mean. It felt so comfortably right. It aligned with my personal moral values, which is always nice to be able to say about a book. And if you haven't read this book and you're hearing me talk, you might be thinking, oh, that means that this character is held aloft as some kind of paragon of virtue, and that's not the case. She has made some terrible mistakes in her past. She makes some errors in judgment over the course of this very story, and she's just presented as very human, but as someone who is trying her best. Now, I will point out another nitpick that I have with this story. There's not really anywhere else to slot it in, but that's just a little bit of tonal clash, and it's mostly to do with the artificial intelligence beings. They're called the AT-AT. First of all, that's kind of a joke in itself because they sound like AT-ATs out of Star Wars. Sojourner herself points this out and says, don't laugh. And there's a lot of really heavy story that happens with these people, with these artificial intelligences, and they trade memes on the black market, and it's just, I get it, like, from the logic of the story, it makes sense that they would use memes as a kind of a currency and sustain themselves on it, especially within this emotion exploit kind of a culture, where memes aren't made to be as good and so on and so forth. I get why they would value them, I get why they would become currency, I get why they would become vital to that society, but they're still memes. And when you're talking about, there's this scene which is really emotionally charged and morally awful things are occurring, and you're talking about, and then there was a secret transfer of memes, and it just takes me out of it. I'm like, memes? Right, yeah, of course, yeah, sure. Again, it can make logical sense in the story, but it just comes down to tone, and unfortunately, it does end up feeling like it's a nitpick, but it does feel like a flaw in the story. At one point near the end of the story, one of the antagonists threatens to conquer the Earth because of our memes, and someone's like, if you conquer the Earth, who's going to make your memes? It's kind of dumb. Also, I will say this feels like a very character-forward story. The actual plot in terms of, who murdered who and who's supplying who with memes and funding this particular underworld and stoking the fires of this. Some of that stuff was kind of lost on me, and maybe that's just because I took so long to read this book, more than I wanted to. I spent about a month reading it, I want to say. I just went and looked. It's been about 3 weeks. Normally I would read a book of this size in maybe like a week, maybe half a week. But what I'm trying to say is this book really shines in the interactions between Sojourner and the various characters. Also, it's beautiful, by the way. The art in this book, gosh dang. The colours are so vibrant. Some of the most striking depictions of a utopian society I think I've ever witnessed. Like, there were many times when I would just flip the page and just go, oh, I want to live there, but I don't want to live there because I know what's going on there, but I kind of want to live there, but I don't. And that does bring me to my final nitpick, and it's with the Compact Comics format, unfortunately. Due to the way that these are printed, most of them seem to be just fine. I own a few more compact comics and I've flipped through them and they look great. But the first few and last few pages of this particular book kind of run into a problem where, because there is so much ink on the page in terms of colouring, or at least that's how I assume the process works, it kind of blurs into itself a little bit and you lose some of the... Graphical fidelity is the wrong word to use. That's not the right term for this format, but you know what I mean, right? Like, it gets to the point where the font is blurry, like noticeably blurry when it shouldn't be. And that's just kind of a shame, especially because, like I've already said, this art is so good. But for most of the book, it was not a problem. Anyway, I don't think I have too much else to say about Fast Sector. All I will say is, if you don't care about Green Lantern, but you like sci-fi stories, pick it up. If you don't care about DC Comics, but you've read some of Jemison's novels, which I have not, by the way, and you love them, pick this up. It's a solid story. It's a lot of fun. I think you'll really like it. Also, it's one of the chunkier volumes of compact comics out there for the same price as the smaller ones. There you go. Up next, we will be returning to the Bat catalogue, I promise, with Batman Prey, and I might try and get that out to you sooner rather than later, just because I know it's been a month, and I also don't anticipate Batman Prey being one of the better stories to talk about. But hey, I'm gonna go into it with an open mind, but I think I have read it before, and I think I do remember it being a little eh. Anyway, I will catch you in whatever I make next.